Someone in Judgment Day is lying. That much we know coming out of this week's edition of WWE Raw. And the question is, who is it? Well, there were a lot of things that seemingly set up who that may be coming out of this, because you did have a lot of Judgment Day interactions on the show, whether it was Rhea Ripley, Dominik Mysterio, Finn Balor, JD McDonough, Carlito, Damian Priest. You also had Liv Morgan burning Dominik's picture. A lot of stuff. And the question is, again, whose side is who on? That's what we got to figure out heading into SummerSlam, because there were some things that were set in motion on this show, I think, that will lead us to the eventual big reveal as to what's actually been going on with Judgment Day this entire time. And there were some reasons to believe that coming out of this. One of the reasons is, of course, we saw the Judgment Day's clubhouse get destroyed. It was vandalized. And there were some things that seemingly pointed the finger towards someone in particular. Rhea Ripley thought it was Liv Morgan. As Dominik's asking the questions, Rhea's like, come on, Dom, you know who this was. You know this was Liv Morgan. Well, I may disagree, because there's someone on the far left of this image you see here, and that is one Finn Balor. When you see the camera zoom in on the first actual footage we see of the Judgment Day's clubhouse being vandalized, you see that there are 4 pictures there. You see the faces of Damian Priest, Rhea Ripley, Dominik Mysterio, and Finn Balor. The only one that doesn't have any sort of, spray paint over it is Finn Balor. He is the one that's just sitting there staring you right in the eyes, and perhaps that is one of the hints that we got that Balor is up to no good. We've seen some of those before, though. If you go back, of course, Finn taking the key card to Liv Morgan's hotel, Finn leading Dominik to Liv, a lot of other things that have happened along the way, the tension that's been building, as we know, over the last little bit with Balor and Priest regarding, who's actually maybe in control of the Judgment Day, who has the Judgment Day's best interests in mind. And yet, here we are with Balor, who has been the one that just seemingly, time after time, has found himself sort of questioning what the Judgment Day is really doing here. And when you see Balor's reactions on this show, if you look at this picture here, as they're talking about who could have, did this to the Judgment Day's clubhouse, before this, you had JD McDonough kind of put his hands over his head like this, like, oh man, who did this? And then you have Finn Balor do the same thing, but he did it in a much more nonchalant, sort of acting type way, where Balor just goes, oh, and then he just takes his hands off his head like this. If you go back and watch it, you can tell Balor is by no means seemingly surprised at any of this. He's in no way concerned. And is it because it was Finn Balor who was the one who actually did this? And how was Liv Morgan involved? Those are the questions that we'll get answers to. Probably, like I said, either at SummerSlam or right afterwards. But there was also something else on the show that makes you understand what we're headed towards in terms of having Finn Balor leading one side of this. And you guys have talked about this before in the comments, and this is nothing new, regarding Balor being someone who's going to be on the other side of Damian Priest and Rhea Ripley in this whole deal. But the main event was Gunther versus Finn Balor. And before that match, you had Rhea Ripley and Damian Priest both saying, hey, Finn, if you need us to come out and help you, we got your back. We just want you to know that. And Balor's like, well, what? You don't think I'm good enough? And then, he says, Rhea Ripley, you're going to have to go it alone against Liv Morgan in SummerSlam. That's an interesting one, isn't it? Because isn't Dominik supposed to be out there with Rhea, so she doesn't necessarily have to go it alone against Liv? And then he also said, well, Damian, you're going to have to go it alone against Gunther at SummerSlam as well. And so Finn says, I'm going to have to go it alone, against Gunther, just like you guys are. And so Balor comes out. He loses the match. As we know, Gunther puts the sleeper on and puts the choke on afterwards. But Damian Priest can't help himself, because after Gunther puts that choke on Balor after the match, here comes Priest. And we know that Finn Balor is probably not going to like that too much, because he told Priest he did not want him to get involved at all. And yet Priest comes out. He can't help himself. He brawls with Gunther to end the show. And so I think that's going to be the tipping point. That's going to be the thing that takes it to the next level with this thing. It's going to boil over. You're going to have Finn Balor finally do the big reveal, perhaps at SummerSlam. Again, we don't know who's going to cost who. We think there's a scenario where Dominik Mysterio gets involved in the match with Rhea Ripley and Liv Morgan. We don't know if anyone gets involved in the Priest-Gunther match, but I do think you're going to get something pretty significant at SummerSlam with this whole Judgment Day thing. And again, the question is, whose side are which of these members on? And to me, the one that makes the most sense here coming out of it, I've seen some people pitch this in multiple ways, but I still think the strongest way you do this to get the most out of each side, I think you want Damian Priest and Rhea Ripley, of course, as the baby faces. We know that. They've already pushed us in that direction. But I don't think you want Dominik on their side. And I know there's some people saying, well, Dom has nothing to do with this, and perhaps that's true. But I think the better setup is to have Finn Balor, JD McDonough, Liv Morgan, and Dominik Mysterio, right? In some way working together throughout all this to make this kind of be the thing where, hey, we've been playing you the entire time, and this is kind of your new version of Judgment Day or whatever you want to call it. And so, to me, you need that Dominik and Liv pairing. Now, I know it's kind of hard, right? Because you're thinking, okay, you kind of had some definitive stuff that's happened. Last week, you had Dom, tell Liv Morgan, hey, he was done with her. It's over. This week, Liv's burning Dominik's picture. But you've still had some of those things that make you wonder if Dominik is really telling the truth, right? Because last week, when Rhea tried to go after Liv Morgan, Dominik made sure he got in the way. He didn't let Rhea Ripley go after Liv Morgan. We talked about after Dominik proceeded to get his face licked by Rhea Ripley, and Dominik had that Eddie Guerrero-esque sort of look on his face where you didn't feel like you could fully trust him and that he was up to something. And so that, I think, still is there in my mind, and I'm trying to figure out exactly how they pull this off. I don't know, but I think the stronger sort of, feud, rivalry, whatever, you get more out of having Dominik on the side of Liv and Finn than you do of having Dominik with Damian Priest and Rhea Ripley, because then I think you've got what have really been kind of the three central characters to this whole story all on one side, and you've got, everyone else on the other side. So I think that's probably the way to go, but again, I don't know how they pull it off. We'll talk about it in our SummerSlam predictions. We'll try to figure out the best scenario maybe for what happens, but I think it's clear that Finn Balor, we know, the Demon, is involved in this, and we know the tension that's been there with Priest ever since Priest won the championship. That tension has been building and building and building, so we know we're going to get Finn Balor versus Damian Priest at some point in the future, likely without the championship at stake. Maybe that's a bad blood type match. We know that you're still going to have stuff with Rhea Ripley and Liv Morgan coming out of this. Perhaps they finish it off in a cell, maybe at Bad Blood, beyond, somewhere like that. So there's still a lot to get to with this whole Judgment Day thing. But for those of you who were pointing your finger at Finn Balor, this episode, I thought, gave you all the indication you need that Balor is going to make his move very soon. Because if it's not Balor, then, I don't think it's JD McDonough. I don't think it's Carlito, although Carlito's an interesting one in this whole thing because you could certainly have, Carlito as the veteran playing, acting like that he's just kind of the, there for the comedy relief, but actually Carlito's up to something as well. So you can't trust Carlito necessarily. So I like how they've done this because there are a lot of pieces where you're like, you just can't figure out who's actually playing the other part here. But that's kind of makes it fun once we do get the reveal, which, like I said, could come as soon as SummerSlam. But elsewhere on the show, you had the main segment to start things off, and that was Seth Rollins revealing his rules for the match with CM Punk and Drew McIntyre. And, well, we know the rules. The rules are that Seth Rollins is the person that has the rules for this match, and he can enforce them in any way he wants to. If he wants to make the count for 3, he will. If he doesn't, he won't. If he wants to enforce countouts or DQs, he will. If he doesn't, he won't. And so that was kind of the theme here. I also like the touch where they didn't let Drew McIntyre and CM Punk touch each other, talking about how the match would be called off if that happened. Pierce made those the rules. And so, of course, it was McIntyre trolling Punk again by bringing out the bracelet at the end, knowing that Punk could not touch him because then Punk would lose the thing he wants the most, and that is to get in the ring with McIntyre to finish this thing once and for all. So AJ Lee and Larry the Dog still on the wrist of Drew McIntyre, and I think having Rollins pointing out that he hates, CM Punk the same as Drew McIntyre, and that he hates McIntyre the same as CM Punk, that, again, gives you kind of your Attitude Era-esque feel with this whole thing, where you know that Rollins can play either side here and have plenty of motivation for why he wants to, make things miserable for both of these guys, for both Punk and McIntyre. And they really put that on the table here, which I thought was important because as if this feud needed any more heat, this was something that really pointed out in a big way. And so we know there's a lot of possible outcomes with this too, and this is one we'll talk about in the SummerSlam predictions video in terms of what makes the most sense coming out of it. Well, we'll see. But there's a lot of ways you can go with this one because you got big matches to build towards with Punk and Rollins. You can still go back to Rollins and McIntyre again. And you're probably going to get another match with Punk and McIntyre too, I would think, at some point. So you got a lot of matches coming out of this one. So that was kind of their, big part on the show, with Rollins really relishing the idea that he gets to control the outcome of this big match, CM Punk versus Drew McIntyre. We also got the Wyatt Sicks revealing themselves here, as we did get to see the faces of Eric Rowan, Joe Gacy, and Dexter Lumis, who took off the masks And now this thing's going to get where people have been wondering if it was going to get to the actual ring, because they're going to wrestle next week against Chad Gable and the Creed brothers, after it was Sister Abigail coming off the top on the Gable here and Uncle Howdy making an appearance to run Gable off. But we now know this is the part where people have been saying, hey, this is where we judge this thing. You got to take it into the professional wrestling setting at some point. Next week, we're going to get that. So how do they present this group next week in that six-man tag team match? That's very interesting to sort of find out, because that will tell us a lot more, I think, about where this is headed, how people are going to react to the Wyatt Sicks thing. And, we've already seen some very strong reactions on both sides. But doing this within the professional wrestling setting, that was, again, we said, kind of the challenges. If you look back at some of the Bray Wyatt stuff and everything, and now when you look forward with this group, I think next week's a big step, because, you really need to be able to pull it off and make this good, because otherwise, maybe it starts to lose some of that momentum. But you also know next week, I don't think they're going to lose. So I think they need to win that match, and or maybe have Gable, intentionally getting counted out, something like that, where you could kind of have him playing, the chicken heel and all that. It's certainly possible, but I don't think you're having the Wyatt Sicks lose next week at all. But speaking of next week, you're also going to get Dakota Kai versus Sonya Deville. We had some of the secondary stuff like that also on this show, where you had, Damage CTRL making their return, to kind of interact with Sonya Deville, Shayna Baszler, Zoe Stark. You also have that trio of Lyra Valkyria, Katana Chance, Kate, and Carter as well. And so that was kind of set in motion there with that. Also something I was going to forget, because like I said, without, giving too much away behind the scenes here, this is the third time I'm actually recording this video. I've had technical issues the first two times, so let's hope this one actually works. But I forgot I haven't mentioned in this particular video about Bron Breakker, because I thought he'd had a great promo here, kind of setting up, everything with what this match with Sami Zayn means, and kind of where both men are at heading into it. Almost felt Rocky 3-esque, where you have Rocky, who's kind of triumphed, and he's like feeling like this Hollywood star now heading into this big match with Clubber Lang, right? And Bron Breakker brings up, well, Sami's already kind of preparing for life after wrestling. He's doing the comedy shows. He's having fun. He's embracing the celebrity, all this kind of stuff. And meanwhile, Bron Breakker's the Clubber Lang here, the Mr. T of the group, because he's been in the ring training like a dog, right? Like he's been training like he's never trained before, because he knows what this means. This is a huge match for him. And so, coming out of what happened at Money in the Bank, now you've got Breakker, who is motivated, and he's going to prove that that was just something that should not have happened. And I think this is where, as we'll talk about in the predictions, great opportunity to put that belt on Breakker. I think the Intercontinental Championship. And Sami also responded here, talking about how clearly Breakker's not underestimating him anymore. But Sami also brought up, hey, he was so excited last week to get back in the ring with Jey Uso, reunite with his friend. And we know that's going to play into something moving forward as well when it comes to the Bloodline saga. So that was some of the other stuff that happened. Elsewhere, you had, again, some of the other undercard secondary stuff. We talked about it kind of with the women's trio stuff going on. But, Pete Dunne cost Sheamus the match against Bronson Reed. You have the stuff moving forward with Karrion Kross and the New Day, as he got the win over Xavier Woods. The Miz is going to be the host of SummerSlam. And so you had some stuff like that, as we said, kind of moving into the next step in those storylines. And I'll keep saying, like, I know some of these, some people just are like, okay, these are not the greatest storylines or whatever, but I'd rather have people who are actually there with a purpose, with something to do, with a story attached to it, than just having people there for absolutely no reason. So even if you're not into the Karrion Kross stuff with the New Day, that's fine, but at least they're not just there randomly doing things that make no sense. We don't know what their purpose is whatsoever. At least they have something attached to them story-wise. And so I like that, because Triple H does that on both brands. And some of the stuff's going to hit, some of it's not going to hit. And I think you're going to get some of those people that are going to get kind of a reset after SummerSlam, and that's fine, because at least they have something to do. And I'm like, at least these people, to fill out a full TV show, especially Raw, which is 3 hours, you can't just have everything that feels like a main event type deal. You've got to have some of your secondary stuff that's pushing further some storylines. And so I'm okay with that. But you guys, let me know what you thought about this week's edition of WWE Raw. What do you think's going on with Judgment Day? How do you see it all kind of playing out at SummerSlam potentially and beyond? With who, again, could be the one pulling the strings here? Is it Finn Balor? Is it someone else? You guys let me know what you think about that. What's Dom going to do? I'm curious your thoughts as well on that. What did you think of the segment with Seth Rollins, CM Punk, Drew McIntyre, and anything else coming out of this week's edition of Raw? Be sure to subscribe button, hit the like button on your way out. We are going to do a special live reaction show to SummerSlam right after the show on Saturday. So be sure to subscribe button, turn on your notifications. That way you don't miss it when we do go live, and we'll be, interacting with you guys right after SummerSlam with what should be a huge show, as we know, in Cleveland. But appreciate you guys watching as always. What are your thoughts on this week's edition of WWE Raw?